What's up, everyone? Taylor Torrance here from Cosmic, and today I want to talk to you all about widening out your sounds. Now, in our productions, of course, there are some aspects that should be front and center, more narrow in the mix. Our kick, our bass, a lot of times our vocals, some of the important elements should be kind of front and center in the mix, but there are some other aspects that really belong or sound better wider and utilizing the stereo space more. And today what I want to do is walk you guys through 5 different techniques that we can use to push those sounds out wider. So let's jump into FL Studio and I'll show you these examples. All right, we're here in FL Studio. I've got a really simple idea going. Just 4 layers here, just 2 bassline layers, a pad, and a really simple lead. Pretty much like a comically simple lead. It's just a saw wave and a square wave. So I don't really want to get too complicated with the underlying track here because I want to focus on the technique. What we're talking about today in this video is widening out a sound. So it's not really about the example, it's more about the individual sounds here. With that said, let's quickly listen to what I've got going to give you context, and then we'll jump into the examples. As you can hear, really simple. I like this really super simple serum lead here because it's about as mono and boring as it can possibly get, and that makes it a good way to use as an example to show you guys what we can do with a sound like this to widen it out, make it a little bit more interesting by not having it just right down the middle. So let's jump into technique number 1 and start going through these. So the first technique really isn't so much a processing chain thing, so much as it is a synthesis question. And you'll notice here within Serum that I've just got 2 oscillators with 1 voice. Now, when you have a sound like this that has just 1 voice for each oscillator, I can tell you right off the bat, it's going to sound really narrow. And that's because of what makes sounds either sound stereo or what sounds makes them sound mono. So let's talk about that for a moment. When a sound is mono, essentially what that means, or when it's very narrow, essentially what it means, is that the difference between what's coming out of the left speaker and the right speaker is very minimal. So a mono sound has absolutely no differences between what's coming out of the left speaker and the right speaker, so that when the sound plays, both speakers are outputting the exact same sound, and so we don't perceive any difference between them, and so it makes it sound like it's right in the middle in front of us. When a sound is stereo, all it actually means is that there is a slight difference between what's coming out of the left and the right speakers. That difference can be really due to anything. A lot of times there's a slight delay between what's coming out of the left and the right, and that can make things sound stereo. But it really, as we're going to go through today, it can really be any difference. Pitch, it can be differences in EQ, it can be differences in distortion. Literally anything that makes the left and the right channel different is going to make the sound more stereo. So that takes us into our first example here, which is that the only difference between the left and the right speaker, well, there is no difference between the left and the right speaker right now, because they're both just going to output 1 voice of the square wave and 1 voice of the saw wave. And there's not going to be any difference. Now, as we increase the voices with this detune knob on, each voice is going to either come out of the left or the right speaker. We only have 2 speakers, so if we have 2 voices, there has to be a little bit of difference between what's coming out of each speaker, and that difference is magnified when we begin to detune the voices, okay? And so you'll notice as I adjust these values here, either the unison, which is basically the voice amount, or the detune, you'll notice that the sound begins to go from mono to stereo. So take a listen to how that sounds. So you'll hear right away, immediately, as soon as I turn this to 2, we're already stereo. And that's because, especially because of this detune. It's changing the pitch of each of the voices so that there is a slight difference between the tuning of the left and the right channel. And so that creates, again, that perception that it's wider because there's slight differences. So when I put this back to 1, we're back to mono. Pretty interesting, right? So, before we even jump into the other examples, which are all processing chain examples, if you're having trouble with a sound and you feel like it's too narrow, look inside your synthesizer and see if there are ways that you can create more voices and then make slight differences between those voices to make that perception that the sound is wider before you even have to go into processing anything. All right, so now let's jump on to our processing chain here on this really simple lead sound. You'll notice I have nothing on the processing now except for this plugin called BX Control. And all this plugin does, it does a couple things, but what we're using it for today is this stereo width knob. At 100, it's doing nothing. At mono, it makes the sound mono no matter what we're doing, so we can actually reference our sound in mono as we add processing that widens it out and make sure that we're not ruining our sound by trying to widen it out. And it also, this comes stock as well with a couple plugins with an Ableton and other DAWs. You can just push things off, and this has a stereo width knob that tries its best to do the same thing that we were just talking about, making slight differences between the left and the right to make the sound wider. So let's leave this at 0, turn the plugin off so that if I turn it on, it's basically going to reference us in mono, and let's go through our first example. So our first technique is to use a delay. Now, we want to use a delay that uses the stereo field in the way that it actually executes the delay. So we want to think about stereo delays or ping pong delays. And I personally like the ping pong delay because it bounces the sound left and right. It really seems to push it out. Even though the dry signal, when we apply a delay, is unaffected, we're going to have our original sound still right through the middle. Our delay is going to bounce things between the left and right, creating the perception that the sound is wider. So let's put on my favorite ping pong delay. It's a Waves plugin called H-Delay, classic plugin. And let me just start all the way dry. Put this in ping pong mode. Turn off this analog knob. And listen to what happens as I push this wet knob up. You can hear the sound bouncing left and right. All of a sudden, this sound doesn't sound so boring and mono. It has some character to it. It has some width to it. Now, I'm going to leave this pretty far wet, but I'm going to turn on our BX Control here and listen to what happens when I put the sound back into mono, even though in stereo it's bouncing left and right. So you can hear with this effect, we're not weakening the dry signal at all because it doesn't get any quieter. When I put it back in mono, you just hear those delays, but when I turn it off, you just hear those delays off to the side. So this is a really great way to make the sound to be perceived to be wider without destroying any of the integrity of the mono sound itself because it remains as the dry signal. So our next technique is to use a stereo enhancing plugin. Now, basically what these plugins do is they try their best to make a difference between the left and the right side. Some of them use the Haas effect, which is making a slight timing difference between the time that the sound comes out of the left and the time it takes to come out of the right. Some of them try to use a pitch, similar to what we talked about in Serum, which is just to detune the left or the right channel to create those differences. So this plugin actually, BX Control, this stereo width knob, does something similar to the Haas effect. It creates a slight delay in the time it takes the sound to come out of the left versus the right, and it makes the sound wider. I'm going to turn this on and just turn this knob from mono to stereo and listen to the difference. So you can hear it, that does a decent job. But it makes the sound, it does make the sound a little weird. You got to be careful with that one. Here's another, I mean, you can't overdo it really. Here's another example that I like. It's a free plugin called Widen by Infected Mushroom. This one does the same thing. It tries to create differences between the left and the right. This one does it via pitch. So similar to what we were doing in Serum with that detune knob with the two voices. Check out how this sounds. So that one works really, really well, especially if you're dealing with a sound where you don't have the ability to increase the voices and apply detune within a synthesizer. This one's really great for samples where you don't have that ability, things like drums, things like that, where it's basically going to repitch the left and the right to create that same effect of detuning two voices between the left and the right. The thing to be careful with these types of stereo effect plugins is that it tends to make the sound sit a little bit outside of the mix. It can make sounds harder to mix, makes them sometimes feel a little bit disconnected from the rest of the sounds in your mix because it's putting them in a very unique space. So just don't overdo these sorts of stereo enhancement plugins. All right, so for the next example, I actually want to jump into our pad. Let's take a listen to our pad here. Now this sound is already pretty nicely stereo. You can hear it's already being pushed off to the sides. But what I want to show you is the third technique I want to show you, or actually I think we're on technique number 4 now. But the technique I want to show you here, technique number 4, is to use an EQ in its left and right mode or its mid-side mode to create, again, differences between the left and the right speaker, or if you use the mid-side mode, within some EQs, differences between what essentially the same thing, but it's going to accentuate the differences between the left and the right. Let me show you what this looks like within Pro Q3, which is a really great EQ for this. So, going back to our discussion about what stereo is, it's differences between the left and the right. So one way we can do this is to use this EQ's functionality of the left EQ and the right EQ and literally just make them different. So if we take the left and EQ where make boosts where on the right we're making a cut, or vice versa. Put this on right. Let's actually swap those. So I've just created some differences between the left and the right channel, like literally they're EQ'd differently. Take a listen to how this sounds. I'm going to turn the EQ on and off, but listen to the sound getting wider as I turn the EQ on and off. You can hear, especially when I boost different frequencies on the left and the right, you really can hear that difference. And it tends to push the sound out a little bit wider because we're accentuating the differences between the left and the right side. You can do a similar thing with this EQ if you put it in mid-side mode, and a lot of stock EQs have this as well. So imagine if I put this in side mode and then just boost the highs in side mode. Essentially what this does is it takes whatever the differences are. It does some math on the back end. It takes whatever the differences are between the left and the right, and it boosts the highs of those differences. So this is really kind of a weird effect, but again, it just accentuates the differences between the left and the right. So take a listen to what happens if I boost just the sides. If I put this in mid, this other one, so you can hear we can get some really interesting effects. It really just adjusts the width of the sound. It tends to utilize the stereo space in different ways. As you make these adjustments on the mid and the side, or the left and the right, these are just different creative ways that you can try and accentuate or just kind of make interesting changes between the left and the right to utilize the stereo space in different ways. And again, help push things out wider if you need to. All right, so our next example, let's go back to our really simple lead sound here. And this is where things get pretty interesting. So now we want to start using parallel effects. So I've actually created a couple parallel channels here. And for this example, we're going to use this send that I'm calling parallel distortion. Okay, this is a really cool effect. What I've done is I put a decapitator on. This is a saturation plugin. It doesn't have to be a decapitator. You can use any distortion or saturation plugin, including your stock DAW plugins, and put it on a send channel. Okay, so just like so. You can take that off. So you can put it on a channel, then just route your sound to this send, or this return channel, they call it in Ableton. Okay, and then as you send signal into that distortion from this mono sound, it's going to create harmonics in the left and the right channel that differ. Okay, and because the harmonics that are created are sort of random through this distortion and saturation process, we're going to get random differences between the left and the right, which again creates that stereo effect. So, take a listen to what happens as I just send signal into this distortion that's and just ignore these two other plugins for now, into this the send channel. You'll notice obviously it's getting louder, but it's also getting wider because it's creating those harmonics that are randomized between the left and the right. And so to accentuate the differences here, you can put on things like chorus or phaser, which again, just going back to that same fundamental principle we've been talking about, just accentuates and creates even more differences between the left and the right. So take a listen to what happens if I put on some chorus, put on some phaser. Interesting effect, right? You can hear that's getting pushed out to the side. This one can do a little bit more than just pushing things out wider. It can also just create a really cool thickening effect to the sound because we're adding harmonics as well. We're adding just more different sorts of textures and grit to the sound, as well as just pushing it out to the sides. All right, so last example. This one is really fun. What we're going to do here is the same kind of concept. We're going to create two different send channels, both with a reverb on them. So you'll see I have a reverb here on the left send and a reverb here on the right send. And I've panned one left, all the way left, and one all the way right. And so you can probably see where this is going based on what we've been talking about. I've got one reverb that's only on the left and one reverb that's only on the right. And what we can do to accentuate the differences is just make slight differences in the way those reverbs sound. So, I can low cut them differently and high cut them differently, which kind of goes to that making changes to the EQ. I can make changes to the delay that each reverb has, which kind of goes to the timing aspect about the differences between left and right, creating that more stereo effect. I can change the size, make one of the tails longer, one of the reverb tails, the decay of the reverb actually longer. All types of different things that I can do to just create differences between the left and the right channel with these reverb sends. So I've created a pretty good amount of differences here. By the way, when you're using any sends, make sure the dry is all the way down and the wet is all the way up. And let's just send some signal left and right and see if it widens things out. Just trying to make some tweaks, tweak a few knobs here, see if I can create any more differences. But, you know, the more I do, some things work better than others in this context, right? So if I create too many changes, it starts to sound disconnected. So I think the name of the game here really is to make slight differences. You know, you can also do those same effects that we were talking about. We can pull in, you know, additional differences. So we can, let's see what we have here. We can put a delay on the left side and put a delay on the right side at slightly different parameters. You know, just more effects, basically. So let's put this one just slightly different timing. Let's turn the dries off on these as they are return channels. And let's not go too crazy. We don't want to make the delay the main part of this. If I turn these off, let's hear how it sounds back in mono. So it's making a pretty big difference. Now obviously we want to clean this up in the mix. We want to make sure that the reverb actually sounds good. This is really for demonstration purposes. But you can hear that it actually does widen the sound out. Now, these are just examples. You can really go as far as you want with this, right? So long as you're creating differences in the left and the right speakers, you're going to create a more stereo effect. And you can use these send channels to really good effect in that way. So it doesn't just have to be reverbs and delays. You can put a chorus on your left side and, you know, a phaser on your right side. Or, you know, saturate the left and the right slightly differently and then put a reverb on. You can just make subtle differences between the left and the right. The less subtle they are, the more it's going to sound wider. But the more extreme the differences are, the more risk you have at making the sound kind of weird and disconnected. So try to find that balance between the left and the right to just get the width that you want and get the creative effect that you want out of those differences. All right, so I hope you picked up a couple techniques that you didn't know about before, as well as, you know, being clued into a couple pitfalls that we want to try and avoid when we are using these techniques to widen out our sounds. So try this one in your next production, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.